Hello and welcome to my channel. It's a great idea to want the presence of God, but when you really get serious about it, you will make room for Him. We're going to talk about it in today's video. Let's go. Hey everybody, it's that Sunday School Girl of thatsundayschoolgirl.com. Welcome to the lesson for Sunday, December 1st. It is Thanksgiving Eve, and you can probably tell from my surroundings that I've already made it to Mom's house. And yes, the sights, the smells, the sounds of Thanksgiving are all going on here. As a matter of fact, Mom forgot a couple of things at the grocery store, so while she's gone, shh, don't tell I'm spending these next few minutes with you. But disclaimer, this is kind of what goes along with the sneaking and doing this territory. No, I don't have time to go comb my hair really pretty. No, you don't get edge control. And yes, if you look closely, I probably need to go get some lotion on my hands. But because I love you and I know how crazy these weeks can be for all of us with holiday and cooking and balancing family and trying to be prepared for Sunday, we probably should get it in where we can. So I'm excited to study this week's lesson with you. Before we jump in, allow me to say hello to some wonderful people, and that's those who are new around here. Welcome. You have just joined the largest cyber community of Sunday school students on the World Wide Web. I am thankful that you're here. I am thankful that you found this channel and that we are now family. There are going to be 4 ways that you can engage with this video while you're here. The first thing I've got to do is get you connected. So look down below. You'll see the word subscribe. It may be a button on your device, but you want to click that, and that's what's going to connect you to this channel. The second step is to look for a picture of a bell. That's your notifications bell. It's going to send you an email every time there is content uploaded on this channel. The third thing, everybody can do this. In fact, I am asking you to do this for me. If you're watching this video, I am talking to you. As a matter of fact, help me get to 3,000 this week. Would you just take a moment and click the like button? That's the thumbs up. That tells us that we're doing a good job, but it also gives YouTube data on the kinds of content that you like, and it really helps us in the rankings. Lastly, you are more than welcome to leave a comment down below. In fact, this week I'm going to ask you to comment on what you're most thankful for. So leave me a comment down below. I love to read those, interact with them, and engage with you. Again, we have a great lesson on this week. Because our time is valuable, I want you to look down below. The first link in the description box is your TSSG notes. Remember, those are my study notes from this lesson. So grab those, get your Bibles, your commentaries, your pens, your handy dandy notebooks, because it's time for us to get into this lesson. Our lesson title is David Worships God in Jerusalem. The Bible basis is 1 Chronicles chapter 15, verses 1 through 3, 14 through 16, and 25 through 29. The Bible truth: David dances in celebration as he brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Our memory verse is verse 28, and the lesson aim is that we will evaluate the events surrounding the return of the Ark of the Covenant, appreciate the joyful expressions of authentic worship, and embrace worship as a lifestyle. I am so excited that thousands of you now join me for Markup Monday. That's when we go live on YouTube and we pull out our Bibles, our pens, and our journals, and we just do a raw reading of the text. It's our effort to sort of get a jump on the lesson for the week, but also to just do a raw reading of the text. We're not trying to be scholars or give answers, but to look at what resonates with us, what leaps off the pages, things we have questions about, areas we want to dig into, and it becomes the basis of our individual study plans for the week. So in this week's Markup Monday, we identified that we are in a new quarter of study. We're talking about honoring God. So this lesson on King David is a great place to jump in. Now think of it this way. Before there was Facebook and news anchors and news writers, there were these people who chronicled the happenings of the nation of Israel. They wrote about what leaders had to say, what was going on in the day, just sort of the happenings of the day. And First Chronicles is believed to be written by Ezra the priest, and not because his name appears, but if you look at the structure of the writing styles, and compare them to even the book of Ezra, you'll see how closely they match. And even the way he writes, kind of the details that are pulled in, really read as something that would have been written by a priest. In your notes, I call your attention to 2 Chronicles 36 and 23 compared to Ezra 1 and 1. And they literally appear to just flow. In fact, the language, it almost mirrors. So believed to be Ezra. Now, in some of what we'll read in the Chronicles, it mirrors a lot of the perspective that's given in 1st and 2nd Kings. But again, you get additional context in the Chronicles. So it's just nice to kind of be able to lay them side by side. And you'll see even in this lesson, there are some cross references that we make into other Old Testament books. 1st Chronicles is centered around the life of David. It includes even his lineage. We see his name more than 180 times in the Chronicles, and we know a little bit about David. He was a man who had a heart for God, and he became king. In fact, he was king of Judah for 3 years, and ultimately the nation recognized that there was something marked, great, special about his leadership, and he becomes the king of the entire nation of Israel. And he was a very capable leader, but he inherited an area that had some challenges. Some of us are familiar with that as leaders. You get a new assignment, and yes, you're celebrating that you have this assignment, you've prepared for it, but when you take it on, there are sort of some things that you have to chop through and sort through and make right, and that becomes a part of what your leadership will be known for and remembered by. So that was the case with David. Specifically, he had a great desire to return the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. If you look at chapters 13 and 14, and you do need that for reference. If you're teaching this week, you do need to read those for reference. The Ark was previously taken by the Philistines, but they did not know what to do with it. They didn't know how to handle it, how to care for it, to reverence it, respect it. And ultimately, it caused more issues than it was of benefit. So much till under the reign of Saul, they brought it back, but not to its proper place. They left it in Kiriath Jearim, and David at this point has the best of intentions. He sets out to recover it, to bring it back to Jerusalem. But if you read in your background, and certainly your daily readings, you've already figured out that his first effort failed. In fact, it did more than fail. It was absolutely a disaster. And at this point, the ark is now at the house of Obed-Edom, and David is really trying to figure out what to do next. Though he attempted to move it, it was tragic. David was angry, but here's what remained true. The ark was still blessed. It still represented the presence of God. And how do you know that? Because for the 3 months that it's been sitting in the house of Obed-Edom, he and his entire household have been blessed. And so now here's David looking and seeing them be blessed. And he's trying to figure out now how we're going to re-engage in this. David has not stopped thinking about it. And 3 months is really a long time to sit and think about something, especially when you have a fresh memory of all of the heavy consequences, the mistakes, your personal failure, your public failures, regret and loss. David is grappling with all of that, but he did not quit. He did not fall apart. He used the time to ponder how to move next. He prayed. He searched the scriptures. He inquired of the Lord for the plan to try it again. He knew what needed to be done. He just needed to seek God for how it was to be done. In verse 1 it reads, "And David made him houses in the city of David and prepared a place for the ark of God and pitched a tent." In other words, here's the big message. David prepares a place for the ark of God. It reminds me of the song, "I Will Make Room for You." The Ark of the Covenant, again, represented the presence of God, the holiness of God, and it was important to David to bring it back to Jerusalem. But again, he knows at this point it can't be handled any kind of way in its transport, and when you bring it in, it cannot be handled any kind of way with where it goes. There are 3 actions that he takes in verse 1. He makes houses for himself, He prepares a place for the ark of God, and he pitches a tent for it. So again, preparing some place for the presence of God to be. And as we look at that, here was my aha. We have to be intentional in how we prepare for and handle the presence of God in our own lives. He doesn't just come into anything, anywhere. He comes into a prepared place. And I also looked that David prepared a tent. We saw tents in last week's lesson. In our study, we saw that tents were temporary dwellings, kind of like the tabernacle. And so he knows that this won't even be the permanent place, but it's important for the ark to have a place to rest. In verse 2, we see that the ark requires proper handling. After David has completed and made preparations on where the presence of God will be, where it will rest, where it will be housed, he now has to consider how it is going to be manually handled, how the transport will be handled. The first thing he identifies is not just anyone can handle the presence of the Lord. And I think that's important even today. Not just anyone can handle the presence of the Lord. Here David says that it was the job of the Levites. And why was it the job of the Levites? We get the answer in verse 2, because they were chosen by God. They were chosen to carry the presence of God, and they were chosen to minister to him forever. In other words, it was their job. So who are these Levites? In the non-printed text, which was in your daily readings, verses 4 through 10, you get a list of who those individuals were, who would carry the presence of the Lord. Again, my aha is that everyone and everything cannot handle the presence of the Lord. In verse 3, David gathers all of the people. In other words, he brings them together. This sort of made me feel like our worship gatherings on a Sunday morning, and thinking about the role of the worship leader in bringing the people together, bringing our minds together, bringing our hearts together for the sole purpose of focusing our attention on the worship of God. There's a lot of leadership nuggets that we can see in here inside of how David moves. The first thing that we see is that good leaders can bring people together for a common purpose or a common goal. We also see here that unity in the worship is very important. Next, they came together to take this action. There was some value in them operating together. They were better together. Great leaders allow the team or the community to be a part of their success. And specifically, here's a great leader that did not make this moment of success or celebration about his own self-promotion. He involved the people in the worship. Here was an aha that I had, and it'll come up again very shortly. We don't all have the same job, but we are to come in one accord as it relates to the worship. And we are all of the people had some skin in the game as it related to the worship of the Lord and the entrance of the presence of the Lord. We do skip down to verse 14. The priests and the Levites sanctified themselves to bring up the ark in verse 14. I noted this, they sanctified themselves. They understood that they had an important role. They were about to engage in something incredibly meaningful that required that they be sanctified. We've talked about this in recent weeks. To be sanctified means to be set apart. They were set apart for use in the service of the Lord, to touch, to handle, to interact with the presence of God. I also looked at this. Who sanctified themselves? The priests, those who ministered in the temple, and the Levites, the singers. In other words, here was my aha. We so often look to the pulpit and we have an expectation that the preachers are sanctified, but there were more than just the preachers who were called to and sanctified themselves for this time of service. In verse 15, if I had to put a label on it, it would say, handle with care. They are ready to begin the work, but the ark requires proper handling. The Lord had specified in the how-to manual for Moses what should be done in handling and moving of the ark. But in the first attempt to move it, David revised the instructions. He had kind of a better way, a more ideal way of moving, kind of optimizing the plan, if you will. But his revision was a departure from the exact and explicit instructions that the Lord had given. If you look in Exodus chapter 25, around verses 13 and 14, you'll see some of that specificity. Even the building of the ark itself was incredibly specific. The contents of it were specific. And then how to transport it. Specifically, it was to be carried on staves through rings that were attached to the four corners of the ark. And it was to be moved only by sons of Kohath. That's who was to bear the ark. It was specifically the job of those Levites. I kind of did you know that I'm a visual learner. I dropped a chart into the TSSG notes that compared David's revision to God's instruction manual. So if you look at the how, the first is David consulted his leadership team. Great leader who'll involve other people and kind of get buy-in, but he never talked to God about it. And in God's instruction, he could not have been any more exact and explicit in what he shared with Moses. How it was to be transported. The instruction manual from God said to be carried on the shoulder through the four rings, the staves on the shoulder, on the four corners of the ark. Well, David thought that an ox cart would be a good revision, and that was a method that he had seen used by the Philistines. Once again, just because you see somebody else using it and it works for them, if that's not how God told you to do it, you can't just watch someone else and think that you're going to have the same kind of success. And who was to carry it? David allowed his team, his men, to carry it. And when Uzzah reached out to grab the ark when it was falling off of, when one of the oxes shook, he died from touching the ark. Because what? Who was supposed to do it? Who was supposed to carry it? The Levites, specifically the sons of Kohath. And so you'll see that in my visual chart there. Here was another aha. We must do what God says and how he says to do it. And no matter what others do and no matter what modifications they make, we have to follow his explicit instructions, because the systems and the methods that you've seen others use may not work for you. So here David has learned from his mistakes, and this time he is clear on how to move and that the holiness of God must be maintained. In verse 16, you'll note here that David speaks to the chief of the Levites, the singers, and he appoints singers and musicians. And you see the importance in verse 16 of music in the worship. That was huge for me. Music is an important part of the worship. I respect all kinds of worship traditions, and I know that there are some that don't incorporate music, but my church is full of music. There are all sorts of instruments from a Hammond. I think we technically have a C3, but I do know what a B3 is. We've got drums. We have someone who's on a bass. Sometimes there'll be a lead. There are tambourines in the audience. There's a washboard that is kind of in the pulpit and on the side. There's all sorts of celebratory worship that goes along through the instruments, and we see that here in verse 16. Here was my aha though. And not only the instruments, but also in verse 16, they lifted up their voices with joy. So we always say this in our church, we don't depend on the instruments to give God praise. In fact, in the Pentecostal tradition, that's something we have to be careful of, because if you don't watch it, the organ and the drums are sort of carrying the worship, but we should never underestimate the power of lifting up our voices with joy. We see that in verse 16. Now here's the aha. That this moment was not about creating entertainment for these people. And sometimes I think now our worship services, if we're not careful, they become times where people expect us to come in and entertain them, as opposed to being an active and an engaged participant in creating the atmosphere of worship. So we see that here, that people are engaged in creating that atmosphere of worship. Let's jump down to verse 25, and this will round out our printed text 25 through 29. So David and the elders of Israel and the captains over thousands went to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the house of Obed-Edom with joy. This is like a procession, a praise parade. It's a very festive time, and David instructs the Levites and gives people their specific assignments. Again, I told you you'd hear this again. Everyone has a job to do in the worship. You also see again here that unity is present. They're on one accord, one people, one mind, one purpose. And note here that everyone does not have the same job, but everyone has something to do. In fact, in the unprinted text, verses 22 through 24, you saw some of those specific job assignments. There was a music leader, and that music leader was given that assignment because they were gifted to understand the music. Musicians, you'll love that. In fact, we used to have a class here that talked about appropriate music at the appropriate time. So when we talk about what songs to sing for what kinds of occasions, this music leader was gifted to know that. Verse 23, there were gatekeepers for the ark. You can think about that like you would think of security detail for the ark, to secure where the ark would come in. And lastly, there were the priests to blow the trumpets before the ark. The other thing that I see here, kind of an aha, is that there appears to be no competition in the worship. Everyone is doing what they are assigned to be and supposed to be doing. Verse 26. I always read, and it came to pass, like a fast forward. So fast forward, and it tells us that God helped the Levites. He helped them to be successful in their assignment. I looked at it this way. They were carrying a heavy load. If you go back and look at verse 15, note that it took multiple men, 4 men carrying this ark on staves on their shoulders. The weight on 4 men, those took strong shoulders to carry that ark. But God helped them in that assignment. He helped the execution. And here was my aha. When God gives us heavy assignments, He will help us carry them. He understands, and He doesn't put burdens on us more than we can bear. He will give us what we need to carry out the assignment. In verse 27, it tells us that David was clothed with the robe of linen, and all the Levites that bear the ark, and the singers, and Kenaniah, the master of song, with the singers. David also had upon him an ephod of linen. There were special garments that were worn, and David wears both of them. The robe of linen, note that he's wearing the same clothing as the Levites and the singers. I thought that was pretty meaningful, that the king wore the same garments as the priests and the singers. But he's also, in this passage, wearing an ephod of linen, which is the garment that would have been worn closest to his body. Now, as you study, you're going to see different commentary that debates whether he was truly dancing in his underwear or not. I'm kind of going to come to my own conclusion. In fact, there's a passage that I give you as a cross-reference that tells you he danced pretty much out of his clothes. And not only that, but we're going to see in a minute that he danced until he looked ridiculous in front of other people. So the linen ephod would have been a garment very close to his body. In verse 28, we see that this time of rejoicing is a very sensory experience. What do I mean? There are sights, there are sounds that go along with the celebration and the worship. Again, we see the importance of music, and we know that this is not a quiet time. It says that there is even shouting. So there are voices that are lifted. There are instruments that are making noise. And again, this reminds me of a typical worship service where I worship. I am from a Pentecostal tradition, and it is very common that we have very celebratory worship. I always warn people who are coming to visit, love to have you visit. Let me just warn you in case this is not something that you have in your background. Listen, it's very exciting here. There's music, there'll be singing, there'll be leaping, there'll be dancing, and someone just may run around the sanctuary. I cannot promise you what will happen as it relates to giving God praise, because there is such a joy and such a gratitude, and there's this overflow of appreciation for what God has done. And we see that that is what David and even the children of Israel are experiencing. It is so much of an overflow till verse 29 is the part where David begins to dance. Have you ever experienced a moment of joy, of celebration that takes you to a point that you absolutely dance like no one is watching? That is what we see here with David. He dances like no one is watching. Why? Because the presence of the Lord is back. In many ways, he probably feels like the favor of God, the blessings of God have returned. And so he dances with all of his might ahead of the ark. Remember, there are other people around, and they're dancing as well, and the instruments are being played, and he's dancing to music. He wants to express his heart for God, his gratitude for good success, and allowing this moment, allowing the presence to be back in Jerusalem. He is happy. The people are happy. Well, except for one person. That's Michal, or Michal, depending on how you choose to pronounce her name. She is the bitter Betty. You can rest assured that whenever there's a celebration, there will always be someone who is looking or spectating. There's always going to be someone that won't participate in your celebration, and there will always be someone who is not happy when you are celebrating. And that was Michal, who was Saul's daughter, but she was also David's first wife. And her attitude was, she looked out and she decided it doesn't even take all that. He's out there making a monkey of himself. He's just out there. In fact, she felt that the way that he was behaving, and she told him as much. If you look at 2 Samuel chapter 6, verses 20 through 23, I give you that in the notes. She tells him, you're behaving in ways that aren't even appropriate for a king. Well, I have a question. Who has the right to determine what's appropriate in terms of your level of praise when your heart overflows to God? And so that was David's attitude. In fact, someone wrote a song about it, and the lyrics said that I'll become even more undignified than this. In other words, there were no limits to the praise that David would offer up, the worship that he would give God for the ability to be successful in returning his presence. We also learn, if you look at the cross-reference in Scripture from the 2 Samuel passage, here was an aha. This is what we learned, that you have to watch your attitude. So Michal was so focused on David and his dancing and how he was behaving and probably the sound of the day and not wanting to be happy, that she really missed the big picture. The presence of God was right in front of her, and she missed it. She missed it because she had the wrong focus and the wrong attitude. And if we're not careful, we'll miss the presence of God when our focus is off and our attitude is not right. As a matter of fact, it says from that day, she was barren. We know what barren is. It means she was unable to produce. Why? Because she had such a cavalier and callous attitude toward the presence of God that it caused her to be unable to bear fruit, and that meant to have children. So that's our lesson for this week. You know, I have a ton of key learnings, and let me just be honest. I hear Mom, she's back. I hear her in the kitchen, so I've got to get back on my post. Here are the key learnings. We can't just want God's presence just because we sense it or we have a desire for the blessings that it brings. Think about it like this. Like, even after the difficulty David faced, initially, he didn't even want anything to do with the ark until he saw someone else being blessed. And so you can't just want the presence of God for the blessings that it gives to other people. You have to want and desire the presence of God because you want him in your life. As a matter of fact, here's the next learning. It's great to have the idea that you want the presence of God near you or back in your life, but you must make room for it. That's verse 1. In fact, spoiler alert, we're in the month of December. Think about kind of the messages that we're getting and the foreshadowing that we're going to get. People have always had difficulty making room for Jesus. Think about him even in his birth story. There was difficulty making room even when he would be born. But what does it mean to make room? It means that you've got to clean out all of those areas, those spaces that have things in your life that would make it so that the presence of God can't even reside there. Think about the things that you take in, what you watch, what you read, what you listen to, who you talk to, what they say to you, substances that you drink, substances that you eat, substances that you take in other ways that don't create a place that the presence of God can enter and choose to remain. Next, some of us will learn lessons the hard way. That was David's case. He absolutely learned his lesson the hard way, but he got another chance. And when God allows us second chances, we must first seek him. Remember, we get off track when we try to do things our own way. As smart as we think we are, as much as we think we can make things better, we've got to follow God's script and not our own. God gives us the instructions that we need. We see that in 2 Timothy 3:16. Also in last week's lesson, we have everything that we need that pertains to life and godliness. Like, God gives us everything in his instruction manual. And so when you want to do something and you want to do it correctly, don't consult people. Consult what God says about it and know that he means what he says. As a matter of fact, when he gives us boundaries, we cannot go outside of the boundaries that he set. That's what happened with Uzzah. He went outside of the boundary. Don't touch the ark. Well, even for the best reason, even to keep it from falling, he went outside of the boundaries of God. So we've got to be careful not to go outside of his boundaries. Why? Because God doesn't change his commands. He doesn't compromise his standard. And you know what else? He doesn't even change his mind because we get mad. David was angry. He was angry about his man dying. He was angry that he wasn't successful. As a matter of fact, he was like, you know what? I don't even want anything to do with this again. But God is not moved when we're angry. He also doesn't need our opinions. He doesn't need our modifications or our improvements. The next is that God knows that we cannot carry everything on our own. And so if we allow him, he will help us. When he gives us an assignment to carry, he gives us what we need to carry out the assignment. Everyone has a job to do in the worship of the Lord. So never come into the presence of the Lord as a spectator. Don't show up on Sunday morning just to enjoy a program. Don't come to see what anyone has prepared for you, expecting the ministry team or your choir or your worship team to lift you to a certain place. But you should come into his presence, enter into his presence with thanksgiving and into his court with praise, and come into his presence prepared to do your job. Next, we just have a few more here. Having good intentions in our hearts or sincerity in our efforts does not replace obedience to God. We must obey just as he tells us to do. Finally, be careful how we judge the worship of other people. Everyone's worship style may not be yours. Some people will shout and dance like my church. Some people will sing politely out of hymnals. I go to my mom's home church every summer in Arkansas, and listen, I live for the whole Dr. Watts experience in the Baptist church. I love it. But everyone's worship style may not be your own, but we've got to watch how we judge the expressions of their styles of worship. We've got to watch even their personal expressions of worship. I remember, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, individuals that were waving flags in the worship. I remember when praise and worship kind of picked up speed in the African American church. And for a while, we were so used to, certainly in the Pentecostal church, to the call and response, that those who were singing worship, we weren't connecting with that. We didn't even call it our style of music. But you look at the evolution and know that God was in that. He was just moving us to another place. And so never judge the expression of others, even when you don't understand it. But most important, watch cavalier attitudes toward the presence of God. Never miss the moment that he's in your presence. Don't be like Michal and allow a critical attitude to hinder or cost you your ability to produce. So here's my question as we wrap up. What will you do, and how will you be aware of and respond to the presence of God in your own life this week? I hope that you will respond with gratitude, with thanksgiving, because this is the week of Thanksgiving. And so to that end, allow me to say happy Thanksgiving to you. I am so thankful for each and every one of you. I am thankful for the connection that we have, the relationship that we have, but most of all, I am thankful that together we're becoming better students of God's word, and we're becoming more effective in the places that we live, work, and serve. And so I pray that you have a wonderful time with your families. Enjoy. Like I told you, somebody's back in the kitchen there, so I think it's my time to go make macaroni and cheese. Everybody have a happy Thanksgiving, a fantastic rest of the week. I will see you in Sunday school. Don't forget to like this video. Bye, everybody.